All right, good evening, everybody. It's very nice to see such a full house here tonight. I think we're probably just about inside health and safety regulations. If we're not, we know where the director is. So let me introduce myself. I'm Roger Goodman. I'm sorry, I pressed your slides. I'm Roger Goodman. I'm the head of the Social Sciences Division, by dint of which I'm very privileged to chair the management committee of the Oxford Martin School, and I've done so more or less since the school was set up. Just a few weeks ago, I made a few remarks at the end of the term of the school's first director, Ian Goldin, and I'm very delighted to see Ian here this evening. Tonight, I'm delighted to introduce the school's second director, who joined us on the 1st of September of this year after exactly 10 years as the United Nations Under-Secretary General and Executive Director of the United National Environment Programme. Before joining the UN, Achim Steiner was Director General of the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN, and before that, he served as Secretary General of the World Commission on Dams. In short, Achim has worked both at grassroots level as well as at the highest levels of international policy making to address the interface between environmental sustainability, social equity, and economic development. And how has he managed to do all of this? Because, of course, he has an undergraduate degree in PPE from the University of Oxford. As well as, I should hasten to add, an MA from the University of London and other graduate qualifications from the German Development Institute in Berlin and the Harvard Business School. Tonight, Achim is going to talk to the subject of Towards a Green Economy, pathway through politics, culture, and economics. And I should just let you know that this is being filmed and webcast. There's no one better placed than Achim to take on this complex topic. Achim, it's really great to have you in Oxford. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much, Roger, and good evening to all of you. Thank you for being here in such large numbers and making this an even more nerve-wracking experience, because having only had a few weeks being back at Oxford, obviously the request to have an inaugural lecture seemed to me to be slightly presumptuous, but I think in some respects it's also been a very useful exercise for me. 2 months have passed. I find myself in this wonderful position of being the director of this idea of the Oxford Martin School that Jim Martin and the university have not only invented, but also nurtured and cultivated for well over a decade, and under your leadership also, Roger, I think taken to a level where what I will speak to about this evening is living proof of why the ethos, the focus, and the kind of programs that under the leadership of my predecessor, Professor Ian Goldin, have come to mark the identity, the focus, and the direction of this school and its role within the University of Oxford, which in turn is a microcosm of where the frontiers of science, of analysis, of social discourse, and of political analysis need to take place. Let me say that this evening, some of you may have come here and expected that I will lecture about an alternative economic theory. Others may even think that here is somebody who is going to talk about some form of nirvana in the 22nd century. Let me make it very clear that my use of the term green economy is as much about acknowledging the centrality of economic discourse in terms of what is happening around us, with us, and in our societies, as it is also a way of beginning to conceive a different kind of future. Now, I should have practiced this before, but I assume, does this take us forward? Oops, no, maybe this way. Then how did you do it, Roger? On the screen here, presumably, right? There we are. Now, again, what I just alluded to is that in the tradition of the Oxford Martin School, the work already in its initial years very much took an approach of a whole of society, whole of economy, whole of the world approach. And much of what we will address this evening has to do with what is happening around us. So the notion of a transition towards a green economy is very much something that responds to the context of the 21st century and even the context of the last few weeks politically and the last few months and years. Clearly, in the tradition of the Oxford Martin School and very much in the framing of a green economy discourse, complexity, the connections, the interlinkages are fundamental. This is just one diagram that already when the Global Commission here in the Oxford Martin School issued its report was neither news nor was it something that necessarily would be contradicted by anyone. What we did not comprehend is that in trying to frame an understanding, not just amongst academics, experts, public policymakers, about what happens next, we have run into an extraordinary moment of confusion. The green economy discourse is as much a reflection of that confusion as it is also a challenge to something that I believe explains in significant part the political reality we currently face. A political reality that is essentially reacting to an orthodoxy, a paradigm, some would even say a dictate, that there is only one way of doing things. And unfortunately, economics, economic policy, the economy, particularly if you go into a region such as Latin America, is almost analogous to a particular ideology. And what I'm trying to address this evening is to look at the green economy as one, acknowledging that much of what is happening in our world today and how we reach decisions is transacted through an economic discourse, a set of analysis, parameters, and assumptions. But one of the greatest challenges we are facing right now is that the alignment between that economic discourse, or the so-called, these are the rules of the game, the laws of the market, how globalization and world trade works, are no longer aligned with political, cultural, and social choices and realities of too many people on this planet. So let's acknowledge the last 50 years have been immensely successful in many respects. They were decades of growth. They were extraordinary periods of success for many. And in looking forward, we certainly should never pretend that these are not part of the reality, and why perhaps we have for so long disregarded some of the growing challenges and problems that came along with them. Where has the 20th century left us? Well, with a lot of people being richer, living longer. Life expectancies are going up. The percentage of poor people is going down. Agricultural production is at record levels. Industrial production, technology, science. We today walk with things in our pocket that used to fill a whole building here only 30 years ago. It is a phenomenal half century that lies behind us. Without going into the details, but there has been a legacy that has come with the 20th century, a legacy that is so immensely challenging now that it is both unprecedented, I would argue, in terms of scale, and also in terms of exponential pace of change. If you just take one look at the simplest number, we will very soon be 10 billion people on this planet. And the green economy discourse is, in many respects, an attempt to answer the question, can we live together on this planet with 10 billion people? Some would argue, no. I will try this evening to present to you a case of why it is perfectly possible to live with 10 billion people on this planet. But that possibility is in large part dependent upon what will happen in the next 20 to 30 years in terms of the choices we make. And therefore, the discourse about the green economy is as much about understanding these realities and these numbers. And I just point here to a few graphics that talk about world population, fertilizer consumption, fresh water use, carbon dioxide emissions. These are the curves of the 20th and 21st century. Many of you may already be familiar with the term of the Anthropocene, living in an age where humans have become the dominant factor in terms of even a geological traceability. These are developments that in millions of years of history have compressed such fundamental change in just a few decades that it is a reminder that these are not normal times. Moving from 1 billion people to 7 billion people in 300 years, adding another 3 billion people in just 30 to 40 years, this is unprecedented, it's exponential in scale and pace. It redefines the entire challenge of trying to manage our existence together, collectively, in sharing this planet with one another. So, looking just at some of these numbers, if you take material flows, the annual global extraction of materials grew from 22 billion tons in 1970 to around 70 billion tons. It is not just that we have more people, our consumption patterns are increasing exponentially. And as you will see, in a world with 9 billion people in current consumption patterns, we would require about 180 billion tons of materials annually by 2050. I urge you to have a look at the work of this International Resources Panel, because it is in some ways the cousin to the IPCC when it comes to the natural resources and what is happening to them on our planet, an area that we have neglected for far too long. It also means that as we look into the 21st century, complexity becomes the defining, framing foundation for looking forward. I simply put this up, and sorry, it is not so legible, but that's not so important. What it basically speaks to is an African perspective to trying to look at economic transformation in the context of social and environmental realities. These slides, by the way, will become available on the school's website, so you will be welcome to have a look at it. But for any African minister, head of state, investor, industrialist, farmer right now, these are the realities that are defining both opportunity and risk. And if we look towards the world around us, then it's not just a matter of more people, more consumption, more stress. This is happening against a backdrop of an extraordinary set of developments. That in our globalized world, whether by resource flow or just by news flow, is beginning to shape the kind of agendas to which, first of all, leaders have to respond to, and secondly, we as societies and as individuals have to respond to. The world, and again, this is simply to give you a sense of the graphic, this is the World Economic Forum's depiction of how the leaders that they convene in Davos now need to look at the world in terms of their decision-making as corporate CEOs. If you compare that to the kind of graph or matrix that would have been presented to their constituency 20 years ago, it would have been fundamentally different. Corporate leaders today are confronted with challenges that are unprecedented, with risks and uncertainties in terms of making investments that are not unknown in terms of a corporate bankruptcy. But what has become a phenomenon is that corporate leadership, decisions that are being taken either with our money or on our behalf, or as bets that our societies support through technology choices, industrial policy, sectoral policy, are literally putting at risk our collective security, economically and financially speaking. To live in an age where a failure in the financial markets suddenly revealed to us that there are individual financial institutions deemed too large to fail, will, I think, go down in the history books as one of the moments in which the politics of the 20th century turned into a reaction against the 20th century, which we now see unfolding before our very own eyes. It is an extraordinary phenomenon that we should have allowed ourselves to construct an economic system that is so far beyond the control, not just of national jurisdictions, of citizen choices, but in fact, beyond a degree of governance, control, and accountability, that we lived through a few years where, remember, in 2008, $3,000 to $4,000 billion bailout money was taken out of public coffers, or essentially borrowed against future generations. It will take us 2 to 3 generations to just repay the money we borrowed for the bailout. Yet within 2 years, the Dow Jones index was almost back to where it was before the financial crisis, while in Spain, almost half of the under 25-year-olds were unemployed, and we were still figuring out how to put bad banks somehow to bed. This misalignment that defines today's economic reality permeates, I believe, deeply into the human psyche, and particularly for those who do not consider themselves to be beneficiaries or part of a class of people, and this is not upper, middle, or lower class, but a class of people that are either on this train of moving into the future, the 21st century, the technology opportunities, but are left behind, are left in communities that do not benefit. Those are the people that are now asking some fundamental questions about who sets the rules of the game. Have we still got a freedom to choose? And the green economy is essentially putting the argument forward that we need to reclaim that freedom to choose an economic system that resonates and speaks to the social, political, and cultural choices that define our societies. So let me quickly dispense with this issue of definitions. I, as you can imagine, being a UN Under-Secretary General and having lived through General Assemblies and many other conferences where member states love to delay any kind of decision by debating definitions. We are still defining terrorism in the year 2016. We were surprisingly fast in arriving at a pragmatic set of definitions. And I would simply say to you, because the green economy is not something that pretends to be either a Keynesian model or a neoclassical or neoliberal model, but rather a way of reframing the economic policy discourse, which in turn will define what happens in markets and therefore in financial markets and in our economies and societies, should basically take a very simple approach. And the one we, at the time in the work in UNEP took was a green economy is one that results in improved human well-being and social equity while significantly reducing the environmental risks and ecological scarcity. There are others who prefer to use the term green growth, and in many respects you could see a degree of overlap here, but my point is, no, we're not trying to green growth, because growth has been at the heart of defining 20th century economic policy, but it is also at the heart of the distortions and market failures that have resulted from it. Our challenge at the beginning of the 21st century with these backdrops that I gave you just now cannot just be to green growth. That does not mean that we will have to produce more electricity or more food, that we will have more mobility. But it challenges the notion that the well-being of our societies, measured through the economic indicator, crude as it remains and yet all dominating of GDP, is probably a travesty at the beginning of the 21st century, and one that even governments have recognized. But we have, as a community of economists or public policymakers, not come up with a better approach. So here lies one great task, moving beyond GDP, which is just like this phenomenon of, we use an iPhone, we believe that it will do certain things, we have no idea how it is done. The iPhone works, and yet even those who will use GDP as the single most important indicator acknowledge that both at the input side and on the output side, it is a deeply flawed yardstick for economic progress, measurement, and indeed for defining a universal set of parameters with which to make these economic choices. Now, I promised you also to not just take you through economics and politics, but also to culture. And, you know, I was traveling a few days ago and I came across this bizarre advert. And I was very intrigued. At first I thought, wow, this is cool. So Heineken now thinks green is so cool that it's actually a good way of selling beer. I then tried to understand this advert, and I must admit, I still don't understand it, but I assume what it is saying, and it is an advert this week, either in an airline magazine or in Time, that, you know, green sells somehow. because people intuitively do understand that what we are doing to the world around us right now is deeply irresponsible. So culture can begin at a very simple, almost reflex-like sentiment that is triggered by an advert, and it can go into the third dimension of economic modeling and definitions. Let me turn to perhaps the more down-to-earth way of defining the imperatives. Without going into the details, and many of you in this room will be, very familiar with this, the things that tell us today that we need to reinvent our economies are linked to the world's water requirements. They are linked to the world's food requirements and what is happening in terms of agricultural production, its footprint, its consumption of water, to world energy requirements, and to the impact collectively that we are having on biodiversity and ecosystems on our planet. This is an extraordinary statement. If business as usual continues, the predicted net loss of local species richness for 2090 will look like this, with parts of the world losing 25–30% of their species richness. Now, if you break that down, and I see EJ sitting here, to more individual species, if you look at the IUCN Red List, you will discover far more horrifying figures about not only extinction, but the systemic undermining of habitat and therefore space for wildlife to actually be part of the 21st century. And why we find it so difficult to believe that this is going to be a reality strikes me as odd, because if you look at European landscapes and you compare biodiversity here to what you find in some of the more biodiversity-rich parts of the world, it does not take a lot of imagination to see that this can happen in less than 100 years. So at the heart of our challenge will be water, food, the impact on biodiversity, but also this ever more dramatic challenge of global warming, CO2 emissions, our ability to somehow take out of the veins of 21st century economies the lifeblood of 200 years, fossil fuels. Let us be very clear, they have been fundamental to the story of the 19th and 20th century. But in the way that we now look at the future, I would like to say that at the heart of the green economy discourse is a very simple and yet all-encompassing concept: decoupling. There is absolutely no reason, and this is evidence that I don't have the time tonight to present to you, but it is proven already because we've done it, in fact, in our economies in a number of areas already over the last 20 to 30 years. There is absolutely no reason that the population increase curve has to produce parallel curves in terms of resource consumption. In fact, decoupling is happening all over the world. In OECD countries, increasingly fast, in developing countries with accelerating pace. But at the heart of this concept of decoupling is that human well-being, in turn determined by economic activity, can only be achieved if we can achieve a decoupling of economic activity from resource use and in turn from environmental impact. So it is not only the consumption of resources, it is also decoupling in terms of the emissions, the pollution. Because, as all of you know, in the atmosphere, certainly with carbon dioxide now, we know that there is a limit to what we can emit, an absolute limit. And our ability to retool our economies, to do this not in 300–400 years, but literally in a number of decades, is now the challenge that is at the heart of trying to define a green economy discourse that is not rooted only in forecasting and modeling, but actually in very significant choices that will demand public interest and public consent, because they will be highly disruptive and highly challenging. Let's just take the challenge of decarbonizing our economy. Again, don't focus on the details, but just to give you a sense, from clean energy to efficiency, to transport, to pollution, waste and water, land and low carbon infrastructure, these are one way of defining a large number of domains that will be at the heart of decoupling. You could also put it in terms of the energy sector, the transport sector, and agriculture together account for over 3/4 of carbon dioxide emissions. If we can achieve essentially decarbonization of those three sectors, we will be very close to a scenario that puts us back on track with a 1.5 to 2 degree world. But we know that on current trajectories, we are not on track. The world did something quite extraordinary last year. Paris is being dismissed by some commentators as a very loose set of commitments. I view it very differently. I find it extraordinary that at a time where the world is losing its post-Cold War dividend, it found the strength and the resolve to actually agree amongst virtually all nations of the world a common, shared climate change pathway into the future. Inadequate in terms of its intermediate milestones and commitments, but setting for the first time in human history, apart of perhaps the Montreal Protocol, but in terms of universality, there is no other example I can think of where all nations of the world have come around the table and agreed on a common approach to a civilizational challenge. Now, many have argued that what is being attempted here is impossible, and we have spent decades arguing over the challenge of, can we actually decarbonize our economies? Can our energy systems sustain this kind of transformation? And let me just take you through a couple of graphs to present to you what I think is one of the more extraordinary stories that we can tell. With the imperative in mind that we have to decarbonize, roughly 15 years ago, countries began to experiment with a transition towards a low-carbon energy future. Renewable energies being a significant part of that, just as much as greater efficiency in buildings, reducing fuel consumption in vehicles. We lived through the better part of 3 decades where the International Energy Agency, energy economists, governments, departments of energy, the utilities world were saying, we don't need renewables. The technology is not ripe enough. It is too expensive. Okay, if it is getting cheaper, it will not sustain our grids. It will make our economies uncompetitive. I have lived with these arguments for 10 years as I have traveled around the world trying to persuade countries that have even greater challenges, namely that half of the population doesn't even have access to electricity to become part of a global climate effort. And yet the reality is, this is out of today's or yesterday's Economist, a very interesting article which I urge you to read about how the election of President Trump or President-elect Trump in the US may not quite turn out to be what some thought for the Paris Agreement and global climate policy. But I'll come back to that later. Anyway, from an unaffordable technology just a decade and a half ago, renewables today have actually transformed themselves into a shortcut for access to energy. On the African continent, where 67%, some say 70%, 65%, let's say 2/3 of the population, still don't have access to electricity in the year 2016. That's hundreds of millions of people. Renewables suddenly become a shortcut for access to energy. The importance of this development is not just for citizens of the continent, but if Africa were not to choose a different energy matrix to that of the rest of the world in terms of the 20th century choices, then indeed you could forget about the Paris Agreement. Far greater risk will emanate from the opportunity and the cooperation that Africa will have with the rest of the world in choosing a low-carbon energy path over the next 20 to 30 years than from the election of one country's leader. I want to put this slightly in perspective. However disturbing the discourse politically may be just now, we need to focus our attention on the issues that will be defining. Africa's population will double in the next 30 years. There will be 2 billion African citizens. If only 300 to 400 million currently have electricity, that means an entire Chinese economy will be added to the global energy matrix in terms of demand and supply in just 3 decades. That's even faster than China's evolution in the 20th century. So looking at what is happening to the options in technology terms, but also in economic policy terms, in energy policy terms, and how international cooperation and finance will converge to help Africa choose a different future, is as much about Africa's self-interest as it is in fact for the rest of the world. What we have seen is an extraordinary development in the last 10 to 50 years. And so those who argue that the green economy is either a paradigm that is unrealistic or not compatible with competitive economies in a global trading global economy, let me just show you these figures. Total investments for the last 2 to 3 years in renewable energy technology worldwide, excluding large hydro, have actually exceeded the combined total in new electricity infrastructure investments for oil, gas, coal, and nuclear combined. This is the most profound transformation of a global market and technology space that I can think of, achieved in the context of a world searching for a different response to the challenge of carbon dioxide emissions, combined with available technologies and leadership by countries in terms of creating domestic market policies, which in turn gave rise to industries and produce investment levels of now over $328 billion in 2015. For those of you interested in further detail, the Bloomberg New Energy Finance and UNEP reports on what happens next, and also the Bloomberg New Energy website for the latest updates is one I would highly recommend to you, because continuously for the last 10 years, those who have looked at this potential curve have been far closer to reality than the projections of the International Energy Agency. It has consistently for the last 20 years, and by its own admission now also a few weeks ago, completely underestimated this development. So here is one example of how something that is fundamental to our societies, we take it for granted, whether it comes out of the socket or whether it is related to the kind of power infrastructure choices countries make. The electricity sector, as part of our energy equation, is already demonstrating that a transition towards a green economy is not only perfectly doable, financeable, it actually is happening much faster than we could have anticipated, and producing the co-benefits of creating access to energy for people who, in the traditional models of centralized, grid-dependent power infrastructure in the fossil fuel economy, would have probably had to wait another 20 to 30 years. Let me move for a second to another sector, the agricultural economy. As we look at the future of a 10 billion people world in which we not only have to feed 3 more billion people, but we will also have to deal with growing consumption patterns, I want to begin by talking about the agricultural economy in terms of one of my central conclusions of this evening. What actually matters about the agricultural economy of today is how many people depend on it for their livelihoods. How many people are employed in it? 2.6 billion people are actually principally employed or dependent on agriculture. The GDP contribution already distorts this, because obviously the value added of a small to medium scale farm or a peasant farm household in Asia, Africa, Latin America does not register in the same way on a national GDP indicator. And yet agriculture and the agricultural economy, and the fact that the vast majority of our food is actually produced by small and medium scale farms, not by large industrialized agricultural production. This is one of the misconceptions about the global food market today, is therefore one way in which to begin to look at the ecological imperatives and the environmental drivers of having to look at the future of agriculture and food, very much framed in the context of people's livelihoods and their own perception of having employment and income in the future. The reality is that land use change and the way that agriculture and the agricultural economy, and I always emphasize the agricultural economy because it is not the individual farmer. It is the farmer embedded in an economy where he or she depends on inputs and an industry and a market, and at the same time supplies into a market where they are squeezed from both ends. Maximum revenue extraction from a farming operation into 7 or 8 global input companies that now dominate the agricultural supply chain. And then selling into a marketplace that is forcing farmers to sell their produce at prices that by implication turn farmers into mining operations of their own most fundamental asset, soil and their land. That top layer of 1 to 2 meters of soil on which virtually everything that grows on this planet, and therefore everything that we consume in terms of natural products, be it food or otherwise, depends, is being depleted at an absolutely extraordinary rate. It takes thousands of years to recreate what we have today as the fundamental building block of our food security. In that layer of 1 to 1.5 meters lies both the future or the implosion of humanity. And yet our agricultural economy and the way that farmers are forced to use that land is actually resulting in annual reductions of available arable land across the planet. I, again, will not take you into the individual figures, but it is a deeply disturbing trend. At the same time, this global economy of ours, embedded in a global food marketplace that is supposed to generate efficiency in production, but also in reaching customers and consumers, produces an economy where, first of all, in the poorer parts of the world, roughly a third of everything that is produced is never consumed because it is lost somewhere between the farm and the marketplace. But much more disturbing, and again pointing to an extraordinary market failure, is that the wealthier you are, the more you actually waste food. So in sum total, worldwide, somewhere between 30 to 40% of everything we produce that is called food is never consumed by a human being. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary number, and just points to the dysfunctionality of a so-called global marketplace where wheat and maize futures are traded somewhere in Chicago, where the news of a drought somewhere in Australia can overnight price tens of millions of people out of their basic staple food in another part of the world, because that's how global markets work. So this is our agricultural economy. Add to that the amplifier of climate change, and you begin to realize that what we now face in terms of securing our food supplies for the future, at the same time enabling nations, economies, but also billions of people to maintain their ability to earn a livelihood and produce their food and supply markets, requires a fundamental retooling of the agricultural economy. Again, we need to look at what is the true service that a farmer provides to society, because if you only measure it in terms of what used to be the common agricultural policy of Europe, we know how many distortions and unintended consequences it produced, but it was essentially a political response to a pressure group. But at the heart of a future green economy in which agriculture and food are produced sustainably and sustain the ecological infrastructure of our planet, will demand of us that we recognize that farmers are not only food producers or production maximizers, they're actually people and businesses and going concerns that should be paid for the ecological services they provide. This is a fundamental rethink in terms of the debate about a farmer who owns his or her land, is responsible for that asset, and recognizing that actually land is only by human invention divided into parcels, hectares, and acres. It forms an integral part of functioning ecosystems, and therefore farmers, in the way that they use or do not use their land, will define many global public goods. Our economy has proven remarkably incapable until recently to factor this into a production function for a farming operation. So again, the green economy challenges, not in a classical economic theory or even an ecological economic sense, assumptions. It simply challenges fundamental orthodoxy, inertia, and preconceptions about how markets function and how they could function, never mind how they should function. Let me move to another example. Sorry that I went backwards now, this way. I want to touch briefly on finance, our financial system, and our financial markets. I begin so by putting up here the Sustainable Development Goals because, again, perhaps to some of you this may seem a stretch. I would argue that in the way that they reflect a consensus amongst all the member states of the United Nations represented in the General Assembly, they are the missing half of the globalization discourse of the last 30 years. This is essentially about how to reconcile economic prosperity with social equity and environmental sustainability. Each one of us could have written them differently. There are much better ways of perhaps slicing, cutting, and dividing. But what is extraordinary about this is that it was approved in September of 2015, again at a time where the world was not exactly looking at the future in a very united way, and yet it was able to articulate a sustainable development agenda, goals and indicators in which for the first time there was not a Darwinist definition of how development takes place, whether in terms of the forces that dominate or the chronological order. Why do I say that? Because since 1992, the Rio Earth Summit, we have the three dimensions of sustainable development: the economic, the social, and the environmental. But what was inherent to that model was, first of all, it is the economy that matters and the rest will fix itself as we go along. And secondly, there was an implicit chronology. You first have to exploit your environment and you have to accept social inequity in order to achieve a level of economic prosperity from which you can then fix retroactively what has happened. That has been the model of 200 years of, let's say, Western industrialization. And that was all very well when there were only 2-3 billion people, and the so-called industrial powers had the whole planet on which to draw on. We now live in the year 2016, over 7 billion people. Economy is rising. China next year will be in purchasing power parity, the largest economy in the world. There is no where to go in terms of somewhere else anymore to compensate for things that you no longer had or could cope with. So now comes the challenge. Most economies around the world have a public sector budget that accounts for around 15 to 20 to 25% of GDP. So if we are talking about transforming our energy infrastructure, rethinking our agricultural economy, and I have not talked about our transport systems, about buildings, about air travel, and many other aspects, we are talking about trillions of dollars of investment. Not all of this, in fact, a significant part of this is not investment that is additional. It is actually investment that would take place in the way that financial markets and investors choose technologies and economies right now. But in order to achieve a green economy, the decoupling effect, low carbon pathways, we will have to find ways in which to incentivize the financial system and by extension the financial markets to invest in that transition towards a green economy. And the renewable energy sector was an illustration that this is doable and that financial markets will respond, because in some respects, they are, by definition, mercenary in the sense of not being wedded to one technology or another. What they are averse to is risk, the unknown, but where conditions are set and returns on investment can be made, why would somebody invest in a coal mine instead into a solar farm or a wind power generating farm or in building efficiency programs? The climate change agreements of Paris have been interpreted by many as a fundamental signal that is now echoing also in the financial markets. Our challenge, however, is that the inertia in financial markets and institutions is extraordinary. We often, again, work on the assumption that those who sit in the stock exchanges in London or New York are amongst the most advanced and, let's say, most efficient predictors, forecasters of the future, and therefore investors on our behalf. Our pension funds, our national assets, they are not. In fact, the misalignment between where the financial markets are investing the vast majority of their funds right now, and whether you take the SDGs, the climate agreement, or many of the other issues that even in the UK now under a Brexit scenario become public investment priorities and pathways for an economy, are simply not being taken up. So the question clearly is, how do we achieve a different set of incentives for financial markets? Sorry, I just have to move in the right direction. Here we are. And begin to create an alignment between where the financial system is putting its center of gravity and where, if you take all the slides in the early part of the presentation, the world needs to now be investing. Interestingly enough, there is actually quite a bit of momentum now. Mark Carney, the Financial Stability Board, green bonds which have begun to emerge in the marketplace. Then the rather phenomenal development where China has, over the last 2 years, studied its own green investment needs and concluded that it would annually have to invest roughly 300 billion US dollars. That's 2.5 times the entire ODA budget, for example, that the world invests in North-South development aid. Just China, by its own estimates, needs to mobilize $300 billion in greening its economy, which essentially means phasing out old polluting power stations, public transport systems, etc. By its own estimate through the People's Bank of China, the maximum it can do so through the public purse is about 20 to 25%. So China realized that it had to go into its own financial system, which will be the largest domestic financial system in a few years' time worldwide, and reset the incentives in order to mobilize these institutions to invest in this economic development pathway that China has signaled through its 5-year development plans. And lo and behold, not only did it issue guidelines to green its financial system earlier this year, which are now going to create an entirely different set of signals for China's banks and funds, it also included it in its G20 agenda during its presidency, which is unheard of in terms of taking an issue of this nature into a forum where China is now signaling leadership in actually addressing it. The work will continue, and I simply wanted to show you this because, again, there is this assumption that financial markets are what they are, that they follow some form of rules that are predetermined, almost like scientific laws of gravity. It is not the case. We can influence what happens in financial markets. It is about reclaiming the freedom to choose what happens in some ways, first of all, with our money, because that is what the money in the financial markets represents. Secondly, that we also have the ability, with the right regulatory measures and incentives, to attract finance away from some areas and into other domains of our economy. I want to relate this also to the notion that corporates are by definition going to be antagonists in this agenda. I think in the climate context, we have seen very clearly that companies are perfectly capable of also rethinking their own future in terms of the signals that will define our economy. And whether that is looking at markets, at the consumer of tomorrow. I met earlier last week with colleagues who, in the math department, are working with Emirates on trying to understand what will the person who will fly with Emirates Airlines in the year 2025 look like, think like, where will they go from and to, what will they choose? Companies invest an extraordinary amount in trying to understand their future markets. They often get it wrong, but I just wanted to give you a sense of how significant a role a shift also in the signals that the corporate world receives will be. If 1,000 businesses are responsible for half the total market value of the world's 60,000 publicly traded companies, we're not talking about an impossible number of senior leaders in the corporate world. And if you take the significance of Walmart, for instance, defining its 2025 sustainability goals and put it on a rank of the world's biggest economic entities, Walmart comes at number 10, larger than 180 economies worldwide. Please don't take this as a way of saying, well, corporates are the solution, but if corporates are not part of the solution, if financial markets are not made part of the solution, you can do as much climate policy, pass parliamentary acts, have Paris agreements. If the vast majority of the financial capital in the marketplace cannot be attracted into a different investment pathway, then indeed public policy will lose. And again, to give you a sense, just from a few weeks ago, the 10 biggest signers of renewable energy deals in 2016 are presented here with Amazon, Microsoft, Google, Dow Chemical. These are megawatt investments that are taking place in this space. As I come to the end of my lecture, let me for a moment take you back to where I set out at the beginning. The green economy can be defined by an ecological and environmental imperative. And we certainly have grave reasons to do so. But my point in trying to frame a discourse about the economy in terms of a green economy is not to say we're going to solve environmental problems with environmental solutions. It is actually about opening our eyes that if you have an environmental problem and you cannot relate the solution space to where societies are concerned, because they cannot only be concerned about one issue called environment. That's the luxury of an environmentalist. A normal citizen has to worry about their job, the education of their children, in many parts of the world, about what they will eat the next day. Another complicating factor relates to the work that Karl Frey is doing here at the school, which is looking at the future of employment. I think this is the greatest Achilles heel to what Jim Martin framed as his proposition for this school. The 21st century could be the worst century in human history or the best century in human history. Fundamental to that will be the question of, will people actually have jobs? And this is not a welfare issue. It is actually a matter of identity. And with automation and the kind of unemployment figures that we're dealing with, the additional people that are joining the labor market, we are now facing realities that simply make the trends of the last 50 years irrelevant to what will happen to this issue of jobs. So any kind of green economy response must also address itself to the issue of labor markets, employment, and jobs, whether it is in the deindustrialized areas of OECD countries or indeed across the vast expanses of the African continent, where another 1.3 billion people will be joining the labor force. Now, the estimates by the ILO are that we need to create another 600 million new jobs by 2030. The green economy is part of the response. It is not the whole response, but it is certainly a part of the economy that is generating net gains in jobs, whether it is per kilowatt hour generated, per kilometer traveled, per unit of GDP produced. And that is why we need to also understand that a green economy discourse must be framed in the context of what is happening to our fundamental reality of employment and jobs in our societies. I end with this slide because, as I alluded to at the beginning, we live in times of not only extraordinary complexity, and yes, it complicates life, but to all those who keep arguing, people cannot deal with complexity, the answer cannot be, well, let's oversimplify. What we see in the political arena right now is precisely the consequence of populism, oversimplification, but not because people don't want to accept that things are complex, but because they're being given answers that treat them as not intelligent human beings, but as fools. The reaction we are seeing in our societies are a fundamental reflex to being told that these things are givens within which we must work, while witnessing right in their neighborhood, in their family, the opposite of what is being promised. And that is not to argue that our societies are so much poorer today. It can be a perception of whether the quality of your life has actually improved or declined. But it certainly is a challenge to the notion that those who sit and say that world trade demands of us to do X, Y, and Z, and there is no other pathway, that this is no longer acceptable. And if that kind of paradox continues to prevail, this ideological orthodoxy in the economic policy discourse, then that will be central to explaining the disengagement, the sense of disenfranchisement that we're witnessing right now. We need to begin to accept that our task right now is to rediscover our capacity to align economic systems, be they financial markets, industrial policy, our energy policy, or what kind of mobility do we wish to have in a country such as the United Kingdom in the year 2030, with societal, cultural, and value choices. The entire narrative that I try to demonstrate through different entry points this evening is that we are perfectly capable of doing so, even though we have been told for many decades that we do not understand, that these are the rules of the market, that there is only one way in which you can succeed in this global economy. And let me end on a thought about globalization, which alongside the Sustainable Development Goals as the missing half of the discourse about globalization, I also want to point to the fact that things are changing in an even more profound and fundamental way than we would ever have anticipated. I was struck when in Marrakesh just a few weeks ago, it was the Chinese head of the delegation who was speaking to the press and expressing his hope and wish that the United States of America would adhere to its commitments and play a leadership role in addressing the challenge of global warming and climate change. I don't know if you see the extraordinary juxtaposition of just one decade, and this is not irony. This is actually extraordinary reality. If you take this little graphic here, which points to a trend from 1870 about the percentage share of global economic power, and look through 1973 to 2010 and to 2030, this is where the center of gravity of the global economy will move. Is it not important to begin to appreciate that a nation such as China in the year 2016 has chosen the notion of ecological civilization as a fundamental concept that is now adopted in its 5-year plan, which in the broader context of Chinese thinking about development translates into a vision of a transition and transformation over the next 50 to 100 years. So let me not mislead you. The election in individual countries, be they large or small, matter. But another way of looking at globalization is that actually the world has a different center or set of centers of gravity today. And in addressing the transition towards a green economy, I think we can, with some confidence, now predict that the innovation curve and some of the leadership and the most transformative policy experiments are more likely to emerge from the top and the bottom of this side, or if you look at it geographically, from the east rather than the west. Now that may be an uncomfortable or disputable notion, but it is just one way of saying, don't over-focus on the events of yesterday at the expense of what can happen tomorrow and after tomorrow. Look at the bigger picture and take the green economy as one prism through which to look at the fundamental and profound shifts that are happening. And just to give you another sense, the dark areas depict 50% of the world's population. The yellow areas, the other 50%. So this is not just economics and GDP. This is bodies, this is people, this is nations. And again, looking 20 to 30 years ahead, this continent here, unfortunately, could not get this graphic to actually work. It is a dynamic one. It will speak to where the next center of gravity for innovation will move by sheer pressure and necessity. The continent of Africa, with 2 billion people, the next frontier of industrialization, of where electrification and mobility and resource consumption and supplies to the global economy will have impacts across the world. The perception of Africa in the year 2050 will be so fundamentally different from the perception of today by the rest of the world, that again is something that I think we should make part of our thinking about pathways through culture, politics, and economics in the transition towards a green economy. Thank you very much. Well, Roger, you... Yes, please.
Okay, question. Yes. We've got a roving mic. Anybody would like to ask questions? We've got at least 15, 20 minutes. We start here in the front row and then work our way back.
Thank you very much for this most fascinating lecture. If I may be allowed, I want to ask you 2 questions. One on the Anthropocene, another on the decoupling. The debate on Anthropocene is obviously evolving. There's still no scientific consensus by the geologists on that, but I think it is moving in that direction. There's another kind of term which is used in the literature, which I'm sure you are aware of, Capitalocene. And I would like to know, where do you you situate yourself between Anthropocene and Capitalocene? The second is on the decoupling. If I could say that decoupling probably is most central to your whole formulation in raising some kind of a hope. But aren't there limits to decoupling? That decoupling in itself raises new questions about the potentiality of technology, and if with the lower source you can create more output, which is the sense of decoupling, which could also lead to a sense of complacency, that we don't need to do anything else, technology can fix it. So just those two questions.
Yeah, shall I? Let me first of all say, I think the debate about the Anthropocene is an extremely useful debate, because in one sense it draws together a realization of the time we live in terms of the collective footprint, if you want, of humanity and human history. And I think that ability to comprehend the magnitude and the scale of our impact in our relation with the planet has found through the Anthropocene discourse a very useful way of bringing the financial, the ecological, the human dimensions together. I am familiar with the term Capitalocene. I have perhaps not dwelt enough on it. I think certainly my lecture today would in some ways even justify using that term, because whether rightly or wrongly, economic discourse is dominant in our age. And I was struck at a seminar on the 1.5 degree scenario that the Environmental Change Institute organized a few weeks ago, when somebody said, well, the only way you can actually do something about achieving this kind of future is in a war-like scenario. When our societies go to war, everything is redefined. And whether that is the right analogy or not, one can debate, but I think certainly we should assume that humans can make very different choices. And that's the other half that I very much appreciate about the Anthropocene discourse, because what it says is, at a time when we are wealthier, maybe not wiser, but certainly more educated, with greater scientific and technological means to act than ever in human history, we can make very different choices about the future. So that's, let's say, my take on the Anthropocene, and why living in the age of the Anthropocene, I think, becomes, in one sense, a slightly odd way of having a public conversation. But again, I think people might find the term odd, but the discourse that comes with it very useful. But there are some who criticize it for being apolitical, lacking political economy, and the Capitalocene is certainly part of that. Now, on the decoupling, it is dangerous to stand in a learned hall full of learned people and to make a claim. But I do actually believe that decoupling is an intermediate step. It allows us to begin to unleash different kinds of forces into the arena of technology, science, consumption patterns. I mean, first of all, physically, we can reuse water 1, 2, 7, 10, 15 times. It's not a problem. In fact, in our economies, we do have this strange phenomenon that, for example, iron and steel today is recycled at rates of 70 to 80%, yet rare earths are recycled at a rate of less than 1%. It's not rational if you look at the economics of it, but it's simply how economies have grown up. And I would say to you today that given where renewable energy is taking us, access to energy, at least in terms of electricity, somewhere beyond the middle of this century, will for the first time in human history actually not be a particularly big problem for us. We are on the verge of being able to supply a world with electricity through renewable technologies that is simply limitless. Our only challenges will be, can we make the storage and variability work? Well, hell, if we can't make that work in the 21st century, it would be a very odd problem. And secondly, can we find a business model? Because you can't charge for something that doesn't cost you anything in terms of input, so we have to develop business models to actually have people invest in the delivery infrastructure. Now, again, I look to Uber and Airbnb and Alibaba as demonstrations of how radically quickly we can reinvent business models where, we don't even own infrastructure and yet dominate an entire market. So that's one answer to your question. I do believe that technology will allow us to, through a decoupling phase, reach different possibilities. And secondly, I think it is important that we do not treat the gains we make in efficiency as essentially license to just consume more. And that is now our greatest problem, that the gains we make are immediately lost. Because we might install LEDs, but we now install, hundreds of LEDs. But again, if you look at just the sheer decoupling, lighting, 20 years ago, we would have needed roughly 20 times more electricity per second or per hour to light this room than we do today. So these are extraordinary opportunities, but a sufficiency economy is, I think, part of moving beyond the decoupling challenge to arriving at sustainability. So those are a couple of answers here.
Can I invite a question from any students in the audience? Any students who'd like to ask a question? There's one back.
Thank you. Given what you've just said, I was wondering if you woke up tomorrow as a fresh graduate in PPE, where is it that you would want to work to accelerate the transition to the green economy?
Well, it depends on whether you want to make money quickly or whether you want to make money later. Probably the most significant areas in which our economy will need new expertise, I think, will be in these three sectors that I pointed out. I mean, the renewable energy sector is one where technology has advanced, but I think, as you may be aware, we have an Oxford Martin School supported program called Integrate that is now looking at, in the simplest of terms, at the viability of 50 to 80% renewables in a stable grid. So the complexity of bringing engineering, physics, economics, business models, consumer behavior together, I think points to still some extraordinary frontiers, including in storage and so on in the renewable energy sector. To be very frank with you, and I've said this a number of times before, I actually almost worry more about the future of our agricultural economy, because in some ways for climate change, we have technologies, we have economic pathways that now point to an ability to not only decouple, but actually to decarbonize our economies. Whether we will achieve it fast enough, whether the inertia will not dominate, that is a debate to be had. But if I look at this challenge of how will we supply 10 billion people with food while stopping this insane destruction of our ecological infrastructure that is currently part of the 21st century food economy and agricultural economy, I think this is another area that I would certainly encourage a lot more research. I see Charles, I think, sitting here also, and he would probably put it differently, but that is my conviction, that this is one of the great unanswered questions that will haunt us, not in 100 years' time, but actually with extraordinary shortages and irrational market responses within the next few decades. And that has to do as much with the plants of the 21st century as the economics of the farm, the science and technology in agriculture. And again, anybody who would like to sell to us or to anyone that there is one technology that will change, or whether GMOs or hybrids or whatever, look at the facts. This is a complex challenge. It's a systems challenge. It requires interdisciplinary research on all frontiers. But at the end of the day, it has to redefine the farming economy. Finally, an area that I have accepted through becoming more engaged in the context of Germany's search for a sister to the Energiewende, the transition in the energy sector, is now its Verkehrswende, its transition in mobility and the transport sector. I think what we will witness over the next probably 2 decades is going to be so transformative. First of all, in terms of supply, what kind of cars, what kind of technologies, the end of the combustion engine, autonomous driving, creating an entire set of new opportunities that meets a society where demand has actually been suppressed. We spend more time in traffic jams than moving. We sometimes spend the better part of an annual salary to buy an object that is parked in Europe roughly 95% of the time across a year. And we actually don't get from A to B. I mean, this city is the living illustration of the magic of biking. or the insanity of automotive transport. So I would say either whether in the car industry or whether in the kind of mobility and public transport infrastructure area, these are all areas that require, and here I would agree obviously with my chair, the kind of people that PPE produces.
Achim, riveting, thank you. This vision of the green economy, does it offer any inspiration, dare I say, any hope for securing the future of biodiversity and its conservation?
Well, it does, if indeed we are able to make biodiversity an economically understood part of our societies. The greatest challenge that I think we face at the beginning of the 21st century is that in an era where just civilization and culturally, we actually just celebrated our independence from nature in the 20th century. Remember, nature was not something particularly pretty if you lived exposed to its risks, be they wildlife, natural disasters, and others. The 20th century was the era in which we in parts of the world actually were convinced. Remember the 60s, 70s, and 80s, technology will, with space travel and everything else, we can move to another planet. And it has been equally interesting that climate change almost threw us back into realizing at the beginning of the 21st century that we are more vulnerable to what happens in nature and in the environment than we have been at any point in history since the last ice age. Now, biodiversity or ecosystems in our economically dominated society have for a long time basically been an invisible asset. Certainly in our systems of national accounting, they were not reflected. So the bottom line always was that something that does not feature in your valuation of your assets, therefore, has de facto a zero asset value. And that is how I explain the extraordinary decisions of the 20th century to destroy nature in a way that was in part a product of the ignorance about how fundamental wetlands, forests, ecosystems would be to our human well-being in the 21st century, but also the sheer economic blindness. So here comes one step, valuation. Some people have great difficulty in attaching value in a financial and economic sense to nature. My point is, it is not defining the value of nature, it is adding an economic and financial visibility to the value of nature to society. And that is where we begin to change the economics of actually protected areas. That is where we begin to change the way that floodplains are looked at, not as an area that has not been built on, but as an integral part of our capacity to manage risk, insecurity, and climate change. And I think we are still struggling, and therefore in this transition towards a green economy, it cannot be only about valuation, but I think our ability to appreciate the value of ecosystems and of nature, or even of ecological infrastructure, will have a lot to do with making its benefits more visible. Right now, as you know, E.O. Wilson in his latest book has essentially called for a world in which we set aside 50% of our terrestrial and marine space on this planet. I wish I was able to give you another overhead from this Metrocosm site, because it has this wonderful graphic of the world where essentially the concentration of people across the planet gives a very different picture. I mean, when we think about 10 billion people, impossible, everything will be full. Actually, 75% of people will be living in cities. There are actually enormous potentials for us to maintain and actually expand habitat. It's completely counterintuitive in the year 2016 to say that. I urge you to have a look at that, because at the end of the day, it will be a decision to preserve nature as an integral part of our 21st century economy, but also society, and therefore the capacity to maintain habitat in which biodiversity and wildlife can actually survive, because that is its single greatest threat, whether through human actions directly, illegal trade in wildlife, poaching, or just through the frontiers of agriculture, palm oil, and many other examples. but it is to make nature and its comprehension part of an understanding that this is integral to the infrastructure of a 21st century economy. And I often find that this kind of terminology is uncomfortable for environmentalists and ecologists, but is very attractive to somebody who has to sit around a cabinet table and debate with the Minister of Transport, Economy, Health, about why on earth should we invest in a protected areas estate. And to be able to explain that ecological infrastructure, the rivers, the swamps, the coastlines, the forests, are actually part of a resilience and even an economic asset, as in Kenya, the country that I spent the last 10 years in. If it was not for Kenya's conservation policies, its protected areas, its coastal and marine management, 90% of its tourism would be traveling somewhere else, which is over $1 billion in foreign exchange revenues for a small economy like this. Now, is that somehow a contradiction to acknowledging the intrinsic value of nature? I don't think so. It expands the horizon with which you can debate with many competing demands around a cabinet table or a public forum. Why allocating public and private investments to nature is a rational thing to do, not just a desirable thing to do. But the trend lines right now, as you know better than anyone, are frighteningly pointing in the opposite direction. So here again is an extremely compressed time window in which we actually have to transform an entire relationship between an extractive economy and a planet in which nature actually has a viable space in which to thrive.
Daniel Kauter. Thank you very much. Very interesting. I very much like that you had the slide on work, because I think that the perspective of joblessness and the threat that we see has led to Brexit, has led to Trump, may lead to Le Pen and others. What I did not see is the solution. You mentioned that we need, I think, 600 million jobs, and you mentioned the green sectors, including energy and transport, but then you were talking about the autonomous car, the electric car, which is a trend in transport, which will lead to fundamental changes, but in Germany alone, I think, it should lead to 4 million job losses of an automotive industry, which today has about 6 million people working in there. 3 million truck drivers in the US, etc. So I don't see that the green economy will really create enough jobs to absorb these people, which then can disrupt anything that we want to construct in terms of a green economy. Do you have real solutions?
Thank you for asking that question, because I obviously had to drop many examples that I would have liked to include in the lecture. So you now give me an opportunity, because here is another extremely complex issue, and I don't want to oversimplify in any way. First of all, you're absolutely right. The greening of the economy in itself is unlikely to produce the kinds of job numbers we are talking about. So here comes one of the challenges that I hope the Oxford Martin School will take on as part of the work it has already started. Is automation an inevitable outcome? At what point does automation begin to represent a threat to social cohesion and, let's say, societal viability, that we actually may choose to send different signals into an economy about automation? Let me just give you one example, which I find very intriguing. The US election just now has been all about others taking jobs out of the US. My understanding from the latest research in US data is that actually only 1/3 of the jobs that have been lost in the traditional sectors in the United States economy have actually gone to other countries. 2/3 of the job losses, particularly in the heavy industrial traditional sectors, have actually been due to technology and automation. So painting the enemy on the outside is not only a dangerous geopolitical game, it is actually one that is either inadvertently or deliberately distracting from a fundamental discussion about the role of technology in our society. What is it that makes us so submissive that we believe simply because you can invent something, it therefore shall be how we produce or run our societies? And you might say, well, that's all very well, you know, if you invent something, it'll get out. Here comes a, to me, so simple and yet so powerful illustration that I would love to see whether anybody in this university or elsewhere has an explanation of why it's not happening faster. At a time when most of our societies are struggling with finding jobs for people, the thing that in our fiscal system we punish the most through taxation is actually labor. Income tax is the heaviest imposition on people and by extension actually on the economy and businesses who are looking at the factor labor. So in order to fund our societies, we have established over the last 100 years a fiscal and taxation system that is obsessed with, not until recently at least, the wealthiest transporting most of their taxable income outside the jurisdiction, but with taxing the working middle class, to use an American term, to the hilt. Now, here again, the green economy provides a very interesting option. We actually want to reset the signals in terms of the marketplace and the investment and technology choices by taxing more heavily those companies that choose to contribute to the bad and reward with detaxing those companies that contribute to the good, i.e. less pollution, greater resource efficiency, whatever it may be. What is stopping us from having an ecological tax reform that will actually leave the individual better off by shifting the tax burden towards a signal into the economy that drives innovation, cleaner production, greater efficiency, and detaxes the factor labor, because revenue is being generated through these other taxes? It not only resets the signals for a green transition in terms of incentives, it actually creates, for those who have to look at choices between technology and people, a different cost curve. Now, there are many reasons why this is complicated, but that's where I come back to my basic mantra. Sorry, life at the beginning of the 21st century is damn complicated. And we have to figure out how, with 10 billion people, we have to manage in such narrower spaces in order to be able to optimize decisions. And certainly I would say to you, in this linkage between a resetting of tax signals in terms of pollution, resource consumption, efficiency, and our ability at the same time to take the tax burden down on income tax levels and therefore on people and the factor labor in our economy, certainly would be a win-win proposition in moving in the right direction. Now, can be contested. You look skeptical, but I think it is worthy of interrogation, because I could provide you with much more data that would suggest that this is actually one of the win-win propositions that come with the green economy fiscal policy reform.
It's with great regret. I think that I probably should begin to draw this to a close. Great regret, not only because I know there are many other questions, but also I know we would love to listen to more of your answers. They've just been fabulous sort of answers to these very complicated questions. So perhaps I could, on behalf of everybody, thank you. And just remind you, it's the normal convention in Oxford in inaugural lectures that there are no questions afterwards, so it's good that we had such a good Q&A, and also that Achim has more in his locker that we could share with him during his time. But Achim, that was the most extraordinary, incisive analysis of much more than the green economy. It was all about the way the world is changing around us and the rules of the game. I mean, you started off by saying, you know, we don't live in normal times. I think we can all agree with that, and there is clearly huge uncertainty. You can say that again. And the politics of the 20th century have turned into a reaction against the politics of the 20th century. That is certainly true, although I think as social scientists, as many of us are here, I'm not sure we understood that until it actually happened. And I think there's something we need to ask ourselves about where we were when a lot of the things that have changed recently have changed. We're very good at explaining what's happened. We were perhaps less good at anticipating what was going on. But what struck me about your presentation was your extraordinarily positive and optimistic message when I think most of us, to be honest, feel less than that at the minute. And I thought that came through very, very strongly. So I think we thank you for that. And we also thank you for what I think in many ways is the perfect example of what the Oxford Martin School stands for, which is that interface between academe and the world of practice. And I thought you brought huge amounts of your own background and experience into this academic forum. So can we thank you very much. You're clearly a man for whom the glass is always half full. And there's a drinks reception out here for everybody who would like to go and join us. Achim, thank you very much indeed.